Good evening, everyone. I'm Councillor Phil Haisler, Cabinet Member for Planning, Parking, Highways and Transport. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this briefing and Q&A session about the South West Maidenhead Supplementary Planning Document, SPD for short. This session is one of several opportunities to get involved in the preparation of the SPD as part of the consultation that runs until the 17th of August this year. We have already held 3 in-person drop-in sessions over the last couple of weeks. This is another opportunity to hear about the draft SPD and to ask questions. The South West Maidenhead area is allocated in the adopted borough local plan with a vision to provide a sustainable, high quality and distinctive place where people will want to live and enjoy living. That is well integrated into the existing community and supported by the appropriate on-site community facilities and infrastructure. The development will include around 2,600 homes, 30% being affordable, primary and secondary schools, a local centre, employment space, green space for people and nature, along with biodiversity net gain. The SPD is the next stage in the planning process. It will provide more detailed guidance to help implement the policies and vision already set in the borough local plan, guiding developers in shaping planning applications and the council in determining them. The format of the evening is that we will receive presentations from planning policy officers, setting the scene and giving an overview of the main content of the SPD. You will then have the opportunity to ask questions in the chat bar, and the officer team with me this evening will aim to answer the questions during the session. We will also be updating our list of FAQs after this event, which will be published on the council website. This event will be recorded and will also be published together with the presentation on the council website. Hopefully you will find this session helpful, and critically, I hope it will help you as you think about what comments you want to make on the draft SPD. I would strongly encourage you to submit your comments to the council, which will be considered carefully as the final version of the SPD is prepared. Comments may be made via an online consultation portal or an online form that can be downloaded and submitted via email. All of the details are on the council's website. Documents may also be viewed at Maidenhead Library. And just to remind you, the deadline for comments is midnight on the 17th of August. Without further ado, I will hand over to Ian Motchell, the Planning Policy Manager at the Council, to set the scene. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Haisler. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this online briefing session for the South West Maidenhead Draft Development Framework Supplementary Planning Document. I'm Ian Motchell, Planning Policy Manager, and I'm going to start the presentation by saying go through a few introductory slides, and then I'll hand over to a colleague. So just setting the scene really on this document. So first of all, this is the area covered by the SPD. So you've got 2 main development sites within the centre of the site, AL13, that's in brown, and AL14 to the south of that, that's in blue. That's the employment site known as the Triangle. This area covers an area between the town centre to the north and the M4 to the south. And either side of the development areas you have to the northeast Braywick Park, which is an allocation AL15 in the borough local plan, and then to the southwest you've got Ockwells Park, separated by the A404M. So, and I think it's really important to just emphasise really the importance of the wider connections to those areas in terms of infrastructure provision, and the placemaking area does go wider than the development sites. So moving on to what the SPD is and what it isn't. So first of all, in terms of what it is, it's a framework, and it expands on and builds on the requirements set out in the borough local plan for example, policy QP1B, and also pro forma requirements. It establishes a series of design principles, including the approaches to key corridors, and in particular there is a north-south green spine and a west-east Harvest Hill Road. The SPD includes an illustrative framework plan which shows how the development will come together in a comprehensive and coordinated manner. The SPD is ambitious because we are determined to secure very high quality development that we can all be proud of in the long run. And its aim is also to coordinate the provision of vital and important infrastructure. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that later. And it will also guide planning applications as they come forward. The SPD, however, is not policy and it cannot change the borough local plan. Moreover, it doesn't provide a detailed design solution. It's still relatively high level, and it doesn't provide one single approach on how to do it. So there is a degree of flexibility built into the SPD. So in terms of where this fits into the planning process, I'd say it's really in the middle. You've got at the top end, you've got the borough local plan, which was adopted in February of this year after a lengthy examination process. And that sets the policy and the main requirements, as I say, in particular one policy, placemaking policy QP1B, but there's also pro formas for AL 13, 14 and 15. And the borough local plan was produced over a number of years, including a thorough examination process and several rounds of public consultation, and was underpinned by extensive evidence base, including a Southwest Maidenhead placemaking study produced by consultants Hyas. In the centre then, where we are now is at the supplementary planning document stage, which is more detailed guidance to deliver the policy and the illustrative master plan. And we've had 2 rounds of consultation. We had early engagement on the SPD back in March and April, and that included several online sessions similar to this one. And we are now at the more formal consultation stage, so that we have a 6-week consultation. And then there will be a series of planning applications that will be coming forward from now onwards on individual parcels within the site, and the planning applications then look at the site in a much more detailed way. So that's where you'll get far more detailed information on design, layout and the quantity of development. And there'll also be engagement at the planning application stage, both in terms of the developers' pre-application engagement, but also consultation on the planning applications themselves. So in terms of the requirements for AL 13 and 14 in the borough local plan, AL 13 is the housing site, and that is proposed for about 2,600 homes, of which 30% will be affordable. There will be 2 schools, a 7-form entry secondary school and the 4-form entry primary school. There will be a local centre and 2 neighbourhoods, a northern neighbourhood and a more southerly neighbourhood around Harvest Hill Road, and throughout, and critically important, there will be green infrastructure, including the green spine, as well as infrastructure improvements, including transport improvements. AL14, the triangle site, is allocated in the BLP for industrial and warehousing use. That's mainly industrial for smaller and medium-sized businesses. It is in many ways more constrained than AL13, in particular in terms of flood risk. And part of the site is to be retained within the green belt, so not all of AL14 will be developed. This slide sets out the structure of the SPD, and the rows that are shown in red font are the ones that we're going to be focusing on today. So I will say a bit more about community and stakeholder engagement, and then my colleague will say more about chapter 6 and 7 shortly. So this slide really summarises some of the early engagement key headline messages that came out of that. So earlier this year, a lot of people were quite understandably and rightly concerned about issues such as biodiversity net gain, greenbelt, wildlife, loss of trees, and climate change, very much the environmental issues, including zero carbon development. There was concern over density and height of development and whether the housing is truly affordable, and the mix of housing and flats. And I think also infrastructure was a key issue that came out of that early engagement, including traffic, what will happen to walking and cycling and public transport, and air pollution as well as concerns that the consultation is box ticking as well. So these are the key issues that came out of the early engagement, and we have produced for this consultation a consultation statement, and that is available online and in the library, and that explains how these issues have been addressed in the draft version of the SPD that we have published. So that was all I was going to say for now. I will hand over now to Ian Manktelow, Principal Planning Policy Officer, who will take you through the document in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, and good evening, everyone. As Ian said, I'm Ian Manktelow, the Principal Planning Officer, and I'm leading and coordinating the work on the South West Maidenhead Supplementary Planning document. So what I'll do is just dip into a little bit more detail into the main content of the SPD, really covering those sort of three main areas Ian explained. So the design principles and the framework plan, some of the other planning requirements and principles, and then the issue of infrastructure delivery. Obviously, in the time allowed, and given the sort of the length of the document we're consulting on, I'm going to give you a brief sort of overview and a quick flavour of what's in the SPD, but hopefully you'll find that helpful. Okay, I'm just waiting for the slides to move on. Just having a okay. So starting with the design principles, this is a key element of the SPD, and there are a number of principles set out in the document that you'll see set out in much more detail than here. But essentially, what we're trying to achieve here is a holistic approach to the design of what will be a new place. So to ensure that we get a comprehensive approach to development, we avoid piecemeal development, avoid isolated pockets of development that don't really integrate properly. We want to create distinct neighbourhoods which are walkable inside, organised around centres of activity, include a good mix of uses as well. And we want to see a varied residential character and a good mix of housing types, and creating what we use in the jargon, if you like, a legible sense of place. The legible really means just a place that you can navigate around. It's easy to work your way around. So you can see as well, we want a vibrant local centre in the development, and I'd like to see a high quality public realm and open spaces. They're there for people to enjoy for recreational purposes, but will perform important landscape, ecology and biodiversity functions as well. So those are some of the key overall principles that the document sets out from a design point of view. As Ian mentioned earlier, there'll be two main neighbourhoods in the residential area. A northern neighbourhood that's shown in sort of pink on the diagram there. That's closer to town centre and I suppose orientated towards the town centre and takes advantage of the good access to the town centre. It will be an area of higher density development, primarily flatted development. And then a southern neighbourhood, what we're loosely calling the Harvest Hill neighbourhood, more centred around Harvest Hill Road and around the local school and the local centre, which we think should be probably just north of Harvest Hill Road. Yeah, that will have a greater mix of housing types, more housing, somewhat less flats. And the local centre is critical to that neighbourhood, incorporating a range of different community uses, retail and leisure and so on. And the supplementary plan document explains in more detail the different sort of design principles that should be worked to for those two different neighbourhoods, because they will be of a different character from each other. So those principles are then drawn together in the illustrative framework plan. And I don't tend to go through the detail of that, and you can see this plan online with the key that sits alongside it. It's included as a separate document on the website, but it is there. It's illustrative. It's not trying to show an absolute fix on the different types of development and the particular locations, but it's an illustrative of those key principles that are in the document. And I suppose provides the building blocks for the more detailed design work that individual developers need to do to bring forward their schemes. But those connections are critical in terms of transport connections, the green infrastructure network that's illustrated in the plan, and it does sort of indicate broadly where we expect development to go, not just the housing, but where schools might go, and where we think developments are likely to be taking place. So, for instance, the southern green fringe down towards the motorway corridors like to stay free of development. So it highlights also those important connections to Ockwells Park and Braywell Park and the need to improve those. I mentioned about the green spine, and the green spine is a key corridor, a north-south corridor through the whole of the housing AL13 site. So that includes the golf course site and the land to the south of Harvest Hill Road, which also has residential development allocated to it. And it's a key corridor both for the movement of people, so particularly for walking and cycling as a corridor, but also for the movement of wildlife too. So it's an important part of the green infrastructure sort of network. And its character will vary along its length, particularly at the northern end. It will be a focus for the public open space and the public realm, and that needs to be a really high quality public realm. As you come further south into the Harvest Hill neighbourhood, then that character may vary, and we'll see more open space distributed through the wider residential area where the density of development will be somewhat lower. So that character of the green spine will change along its length. It won't be all the same. Those photographs at the bottom just kind of illustrative of the sort of thing that you might be looking at, but obviously the detail is to be worked up. You mentioned that Harvest Hill Road is a key corridor in the proposed housing area as well. It's a key corridor partly because it is a key point of access into the site from the point of view of vehicular access, so road access both into the golf course land to the north of the road and into the housing land to the south of Harvest Hill Road as well. But from a designer's perspective as well, it's really important in terms of creating a sense of arrival as you come along Harvest Hill Road, and that may involve bringing development quite close up to the road in places. In other places it may be set back because of vegetation and tree cover, so the character of how that road is and that corridor is dealt with will probably vary along its length. But I think one of the things to note really is that traffic will undoubtedly move slower along Harvest Hill Road now than in the future than it does now. Partly because of the additional junctions, partly because of the importance of crossings, and just because you'll know that you're moving into a residential area, and speed limits are likely to be lower as well. Worth highlighting again, the way that crossings are provided across Harvest Hill Road are really important. So for instance, where the green spine comes through, then it's really important that a high quality crossing is provided there, and the kind of right public realm around that, but also other crossing points as well, and just making sure there's a good connection along the whole of Harvest Hill Road. And one of the other key requirements that we think is necessary along Harvest Hill Road is to provide a segregated walk and cycle path, probably be on the north side of Harvest Hill Road, and extending right across along its length. It may not be capable of being totally segregated once you hit the residential areas at either end, but certainly where the golf course is at the moment, then there's scope to segregate that walk cycle route from Harvest Hill Road and provide a really high quality facility. That's a quick answer through design principles. Just moving on to a few other principles and requirements in the document that we're consulting on, around community needs, connectivity, and sustainability and environment. And I'll just run through these quite quickly. A number of these just reflect what is in the local plan and those pro formas that Ian Motchell mentioned earlier. So we are talking about approximately 2,600 homes on the housing area. We think broadly a mix of about half and half in terms of flats and housing, but that may require being slightly more creative in terms of housing types and typologies, and not necessarily always traditional two-storey houses. So that there's more detail in the design section about what that might entail. Also affordable housing, 30%, and a high proportion of that would need to be rented housing, including houses as well as flats. And then self-build, custom-build housing and a proportion of homes that would also be accessible in terms of those with mobility issues. We've outlined really already the main kind of community facilities, so I won't run through the detail here, other than to say we'd be looking to include a community building or community facility within the local centre, and also a health hub, and we're kind of exploring with the health providers, with the NHS and the GPs, the nature of what that hub might be. It may involve relocation of one or more existing surgeries, it may not do, and clearly if that was to happen there would be more consultation on that particular issue. As already touched on, connectivity is critical really, and it's critical partly because to take advantage of what is this kind of favourable location really relative to the town centre and other key facilities like the leisure centre, obviously the railway station and so on. So getting the connections both within the site along the Green Spine and Harvest Hill Road, as I touched on, also across other parts of the golf course land, but also then making those connections to the wider areas, so that it's really, the development is really accessible to those range of other facilities. Public transport needs to be integrated into development, so a bus service running through the site is what we would envisage, again through the residential site in particular. That might involve diverting an existing bus service. That's one option, perhaps the preferred option there, but we'd welcome views on that as we as part of this consultation. That needs to be integrated with schools and the local centre, and we've been looking at a package of measures to make that bus service attractive for new residents in the area. Then one of the key themes coming out of discussions in the recent drop-in sessions has been about the traffic impact of development, and we've been doing a bit more traffic modelling to look at the key junctions around the site and work out which ones need improving and what those improvements might be. And the plan there, you'll see, just highlights the main junctions that we've been looking at, and you can see them listed on the screen there. And I won't go through the detail, but we've been working up at this stage kind of concept schemes for how we might improve those junctions to create additional capacity. Further down the line, when those schemes are worked up in more detail, there would undoubtedly be consultation on those schemes, so you can see the detail of those. But at the moment, they're kind of at a conceptual sort of level. And finally, on the sort of theme of sustainability and environment, and certainly a kind of a key topic, both in the earlier engagement we had and certainly from talking to people in the last couple of weeks, then the SPD is looking for this to be a zero carbon development, and that will contribute and ensure that the development contributes to meeting our borough's renewable energy targets. And we've got a position statement, a policy position statement on this, and other guidance that we refer to in the document to, I suppose, signpost developers to ensure that they do the right thing. We don't want to necessarily prescribe the exact technology, but we want to make sure they hit that zero carbon target by whatever the best means is. And also to secure 10% biodiversity net gain, maximising biodiversity through retention and mitigation on site. But if that can't be achieved, and that's quite possible, then the SPD sets a hierarchy of where we'd be looking for additional biodiversity enhancements and habitat provision to be made. So within that red line area that Ian showed you earlier, the SPD area initially, then near to the SPD, and if necessary further afield in the borough, but certainly to stay within the borough in terms of securing that biodiversity net gain. And finally, we know the loss of trees is a big concern to people, and I think we've been upfront through this process to recognise that there will be some loss of trees to accommodate development, particularly on the golf course site, part of the residential area. But there will need to be detailed tree surveys undertaken by the developers, and we'd be looking to retain the most important trees on the site identified through those surveys, retain brush into copse, and importantly, I suppose, retaining the boundary planting and the boundary trees that provide that important buffer to the existing residential areas, as well as securing new tree planting to improve, I suppose, the overall greenery of the site. The SPD talks about a number of other issues you can see on the slide there. Not time to go into the detail now, but do have a look at some of these sections that just touch on those other topics. And finally, just moving on to infrastructure and the delivery of infrastructure. And I think it's fair to say this is a really important part of the document to try and coordinate the infrastructure delivery. Coordinate because there are a number of different landowners and developers with an interest in the Southwest Maidenhead area, and in particular the housing area. So we're dealing with multiple developers, and I suppose there's a couple of important principles really want to work to in terms of the delivery of infrastructure. One is to ensure that the development sort of washes its own face really in terms of paying for the impact that it has on infrastructure and the need to improve infrastructure across a range of different sort of aspects of infrastructure provision. And I suppose second is to ensure that those developers, I suppose, make equitable contributions to infrastructure delivery. And that's done really through what's called the Community Infrastructure Levy, or CIL, which is effectively a levy on the housing side, on the housing development. And then Section 106 agreements, legal agreements between the council and the developers, which can also secure payments for infrastructure improvements as well, or possibly direct provision by developers of infrastructure. So that's the key principle we're working to, or key principles. In many instances, we expect the developers to fund infrastructure in full. In some instances, it's not appropriate to do that because we can only ask them to make proportionate contributions to development, where to infrastructure, where the impact of that development perhaps is only partly justifies infrastructure. So a good example of that would be the provision of the secondary school on the site, where the residential development of around 2,600 homes wouldn't justify a full 7-form entry secondary school. That secondary school would also be meeting the needs of other parts of growth in other parts of Maidenhead. So a proportionate contribution would be required in that instance. So the SPD sets out an infrastructure schedule and estimated costings somewhere in the region of 100 to 110 million pounds, and we need to add in some costs for the land for some of those community facilities, particularly schools, and we're doing some more work on that at the moment. The assumption that some infrastructure will need to be funded by development outside of the Southwest Maidenhead area. So that's that kind of proportionality point that I just touched on. So we've estimated roughly what will come forward from CIL, the Community Infrastructure Levy, and we've also then started to look at, well, what the remaining funding gap is, and looking at a means of equitably distributing that final element of infrastructure costs across the various developers, including the Triangle site, which will have its own sort of formula for the Section 106 contributions, because it doesn't provide for community infrastructure levy, because the CIL is not chargeable on employment development. So that, in a nutshell, that's the kind of approach on infrastructure delivery. There's clearly an important question about timing, and the SPD talks about certain things needing to be delivered early on in the development, particularly things like the walking and cycling infrastructure, the public transport infrastructure, to embed what you might call good sustainable travel habits, active travel habits, early on in the development for new residents. Some things will come later, in particular secondary school, and that's just a fact of the level of pupil generation, at what point that's required, related to the pupil sort of forecast going forward. Overall, we've I suppose done a bit of a sense check on that infrastructure package, on those costs, and we think those costs and the requirements on developers is broadly consistent with some earlier work we did on testing the viability of the development of the South West Maidenhead area, and particularly the residential development that was done for the Borough Local Plan. So we think it's a deliverable, viable package from the work that we've already done on the plan. So at that point, I'm just going to hand back to Ian Motchell, and he'll just run through one or two final slides on the sort of process going forwards, and then we'll move on to the question and answers session.
Thank you, Ian. Hopefully you can hear me. So I was just going to now say a bit about the current consultation and what we've been doing. So first of all, it's a 6-week consultation, started exactly 3 weeks ago on the 6th of July, and it runs up until 17th of August, midnight, and there are full details on how to respond within the website, on our website, and the consultation portal. And if you click on that link, you will get to our web page. There's also hard copies of documents and response forms in Maidenhead Library, and we will be updating our frequently asked questions sheet shortly with any new answers. And I'd just like to remind everyone that you can put questions in the chat box tonight. I don't think we've got any questions yet, so hopefully we'll get some soon. We've had 3 drop-in sessions, and the first 2 were held in Maidenhead Library over the last 2 weeks, and we had one, the final one was yesterday at the Braywick Leisure Centre. So we deliberately phased these drop-in sessions over different weeks and on different days of the week. And the next couple of slides summarise some of the more popular topics from those sessions, and a lot of it was very similar to the early engagement messages. So several people were saying that, why do we need the housing now? Because the numbers have changed following household projections. Several people said that they thought there was too much development and there would be a too high a density. There was concern over how many stories the blocks of flats would be, especially at the northern end of the site. Many people commented on traffic issues and transport, and where would the cars go, and how, whether or not the road improvements would be sufficient to mitigate the additional traffic. And several people asked about vehicle access into the housing site, and in particular whether Harvest Hill Road would be wide enough. And including the fact that it's difficult to pass at times. So there was several people who asked about schools and health provision, and as Ian mentioned earlier about the health hub and what would happen to existing doctors' surgeries, and what the public transport provision would be in terms of, for example, buses. Several people mentioned air pollution, and a strong concern over whether the housing would be genuinely affordable. And certainly, I think that particularly yesterday's session at Braywick Centre, many people expressing strong concern over biodiversity and green corridors for wildlife and loss of trees and issues around carbon emissions and take up, and the need to compensate for that in terms of climate change, and also how long it would take to build the housing, and the disruption that would cause to residents during the build out phases as well. So these are sort of some of the key messages that we heard loud and clear from the three engagement sessions. And just like to thank everybody that turned up to those. We had some good conversations, quite robust at times, but it was very helpful for us. So what will happen next, really? So after the consultation has finished in 3 weeks' time, we will look very carefully at all the comments received and all the issues raised during the consultation. We will then revise the SPD to address those comments as far as we can, and we will be aiming to complete the work during the autumn, or late autumn probably, and once it's fine, once we've done that, we'll be taking a report back to our cabinet for them to decide whether to adopt the document as supplementary planning document. So that's really the sort of next step. So and then once it's adopted, it won't have development plan status, but it will have considerable weight for when the planning applications are received. So really that's as much as I was going to say. We're now going to have a Q&A session. I think we have now started to receive some questions, so I'll hand over now to my colleague Ian Gillespie, who's going to take us through some of those comments, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. As the second Ian said, I'm also an Ian Gillespie. I'm a planning consultant working with the Royal Borough on the Southwest Maidenhead SPD, and Ian's quite right. We've started getting some questions in now, which is great. Quite a few of them about infrastructure matters relating to Southwest Maidenhead. So the first one is around will there be extra sewage treatment capacity introduced to accommodate all the new development? Ian Motchell, is that one that you could pick up, please?
Yes, I can answer that. Thank you very much, Ian. Yes, as part of the process of producing the borough local plan, we engaged with infrastructure providers, including, for example, Thames Water over sewage infrastructure, and they have reassured us that the site can accommodate the sewage infrastructure network can accommodate the levels of new development proposed, and that existing sewage treatment works would be reinforced as necessary through that process.
Thank you, Ian. The next question to come in was about the roads. Will roads be identified? And I've just asked in the chat function whether the person that raised that question could just expand a little bit more so we can understand exactly what it is they'd like to know a bit more about, and we'll try and respond to that. And then there's a question about how tall the flats will be, and I'm assuming that's in relation to not just the northern part of the development, but also the flatted accommodation that will be in the local centre near to Harvest Hill Road. Ian Manxlow, do you want to pick that one up, please?
Yeah, I'll come in at this point. Perhaps useful for people to understand that almost running in parallel to the work on the South West Maidenhead supplementary planning document, we'll be doing some work on a borough-wide tall buildings guidance document, also a supplementary planning document, and we'll be going out to consultation on that relatively soon. And that does say a little bit about the South West Maidenhead area and building heights that may be appropriate on the particularly the AL13 housing area. So I mentioned in the presentation that the northern neighbourhood close to the town centre is likely to be primarily flatted development. The draft document on tall buildings is quite a bit of an indication, a bit more guidance on that. I think broadly you'd be looking at something like 6 stories in terms of height at that northern end, but there may be some particularly like landmark buildings that might be a bit higher, potentially up to about 8 stories at that northern sort of neighbourhood. That gives you an indication for sort of heights, 6 to 8 sort of maximum probably at that northern end. But at the local, in the area around the local centre, the local plan itself actually talks about potential heights of development that's close to the local centre, because the local centre will be a focus for, I suppose, development activity. So I think it may be an area where we may see some flatted development, albeit it's in that southern neighbourhood, but I think there'll be potentially some flats in and around the centre. They may even be on top of a local centre type building, and something in the region of 4 to 6 stories you might be looking at in and around the local centre. Thanks, Ian.
So moving on to the next question, how much parking will be provided for residents in the development? This is an interesting one, I think, because residents will obviously want enough parking for their own cars, but we also want, through the SPD and the local plan, to encourage more sustainable modes of transport. So encourage people to walk and cycle and to use public transport to the local facilities and services. So there's a lot in the SPD about making the cycling and walking routes through South West Maidenhead safe, attractive and convenient, so that parents will be able to walk their children to school, access the local centre. And also, of course, South West Maidenhead is located in close proximity to the town centre. So there's a real balance to be struck between providing enough parking so that they're not clogging the local streets within the area, but at the same time encouraging people to make more sustainable travel choices. And more detailed guidance on parking will be provided through a separate supplementary planning document specifically on parking, which the policy team and Chris Joyce's team are working upon. Is there anything more you wanted to add to that at all, Ian Manxlow and Watchell?
No, I don't think so. I think the detailed parking standards, which obviously vary depending on location and depending on the types of houses, the size of houses, will go into that more detailed parking standard document in due course. Yeah.
We then come on to a question around the potential relocation of some existing medical centres, doctor surgeries, into a health hub within the local centre at South West Maidenhead, and the concern that those residents that currently have a GP surgery within walking distance of where they live would now need to travel further to this health hub. I mean, I think I can comment generally there that this is something that we're seeing up and down the country, that the clinical commissioning groups and surgeries are finding that there are significant economies of scale, bigger facilities only requiring a single reception area rather than having 4 or 5 separate facilities, all with their own receptionist, etc. So there is a trend towards having larger facilities with a wider range of services being offered within those facilities. But Ian Manxlow, I know you've been involved specifically in the discussions there. Do you want to come in?
Yes, I think just to say really that we've had a series of discussions with the NHS, CCG, the providers of primary care, obviously with the GPs themselves, and it's still early days really in terms of those discussions as to what might be the best solution. I think what we don't want to do as a planning authority and through this supplementary planning document is, I suppose, prescribe a healthcare solution here. I mean, I think it's really important that the providers, the experts, if you like, are the ones that ultimately say what would work best in this part of Maidenhead. So we're very open to alternatives that either involve relocation of surgeries or maybe it's a somewhat lesser scale, and that may be a surgery that primarily just meets the needs of the development and perhaps the immediate surrounding area. So I think what would happen is that if there were any proposals to relocate an existing surgery onto a larger health hub on the golf course area, on the housing site in the local centre, then I'm sure there will be local consultation through the NHS and the GPs on any sort of proposal. So it is early days. I think we just want to facilitate what the best solution is from a healthcare point of view.
Thank you, Ian. We've then got a couple of questions which I think can be grouped together around trees on the site and loss of trees and replanting of new trees. So a question specifically about how many trees that will be lost on the site as a result of the development, and it's not possible at this stage in the planning process to put a specific number down, because there isn't a detailed layout which will confirm which trees can be retained and which will need to be removed. And then related to that question, will new trees be planted? Well, yes, certainly new trees will need to be planted on site, and there may also need to be some planting off site to assist in compensating more generally in terms of biodiversity, and we might come on to that in a bit more detail later. But also picking up on this point, it's been in the national papers quite a bit about climate change and the benefits of having tree cover in terms of keeping street temperatures down and not having too much hard surface, concrete, etc., which bounces the heat back into the environment. And that's certainly something that's been discussed internally with officers about how we can manage the environment within South West Maidenhead, a green environment, whilst obviously also accommodating the scale of development proposed. Rob, do you want to come in on that sort of the general sort of street scene and the green spine that's proposed at South West Maidenhead?
Yeah, I can say a little bit more. I think you've kind of covered quite a lot of it. Obviously, the green spine and the other sort of green corridors that we've got in the proposals there, first and foremost to enable people to move around and get access to the facilities and the functions they need, but they also serve this dual purpose in terms of enabling vegetation and biodiversity to be introduced into some of those areas as well. So enabling wildlife to move down sort of streets and routes that are segregated from traffic. So they'll serve a dual purpose for a biodiversity and a movement purpose.
Thank you, Rob. And then I think this might be a little bit more detail as I asked for in terms of the roads, and the question is where will the roads be within the development? So the framework master plan that we have in the draft SPD is illustrative, but we have identified the main external connections into the development site, both north of Harvest Hill Road and south of Harvest Hill Road. and also illustratively where the access will be, or is likely to be, into the triangle site. How the actual roads then move through the development areas, they've been shown illustratively in the framework master plan, and that the detail of exactly where the roads will run will come through at the planning application stage as part of the detailed layout and design. Then got a question on affordable housing and what is the Royal Borough's definition of affordable, because different people will have different views on affordability. Ian Motchell, is that something you want to pick up generally?
Yes, I can pick that one up. Thanks, Ian. Okay, well, affordable housing, there are different types of affordable housing, of course, and the type of affordable housing that we particularly favour and we think is more affordable is social rented housing, and that's accommodation rented through housing associations usually. I mean, there are different other types. Shared ownership, for example, is another type of affordable housing, but some of these, I mean, we recognise obviously it's an expensive area, and the market housing is likely to be relatively expensive, and not everybody is going to be able to genuinely afford that. So of the 30% affordable housing, probably close to half of that would need to be social rented, because that's the type that we genuinely need the most of. So there is scope for a considerable amount of new social rented housing to be provided through this scheme in the borough.
Thank you, Ian. There's a follow-on question then, I think, really, what is the average car parking space per dwelling? I think that's how many spaces are each dwelling within the Southwest Maidenhead area going to have, and I think, as Ian Manktelow has explained already, it will vary depending upon whereabouts within the site you are, and also the form of dwelling. So if it's a large 4-5 bed family house, that will have more parking provision clearly than a 1 bed flat. But similarly, as you move further north within the development and closer to the town centre, we will probably be looking at having reduced parking provision there, expecting more people to be perhaps jumping on the train to commute or walking into the town centre, and perhaps having on average a lower level of car ownership. But because we're at the sort of principal stage through the SPD process, and the precise housing mix and the precise layout hasn't been determined yet, and also because the parking SPD is still being developed, we can't give an average car parking space per dwelling figure at this stage. We've then got a question about what is the plan for deer living in the area, and I guess this is probably a wider question as well, about what is the plan for biodiversity and nature conservation more widely, and it's certainly something that's figured highly in the discussions on the draft SPD, and also through the engagement sessions to date. This sort of issue has been raised on each occasion. So generally, in terms of biodiversity, there will be a requirement to deliver a 10% net gain overall, but that doesn't talk about each individual species. So it may be that you have some new environment created of a particular type which encourages certain types of flora and fauna, but the deer themselves specifically, I think with the scale and form of development that is being proposed, are likely to move off the site, is the reality. But there will generally overall need to be a 10% net gain in biodiversity as the SPD sets out, either on the site itself or in proximity to the site, so on adjoining areas. And then a very specific question: do we know what percentage of AL14 is at risk of flooding? Not probably able to put you on the spot for a precise percentage, Ian, but Ian Motchley, are you able to help generally with that question?
I can answer generally. Yeah, I don't have the exact percentages to hand, but certainly, yeah, I think a reasonably high percentage of the site, especially towards the western northern end of the triangle site, is within flood zones 2 and flood zones 3. So flood zone 2 being medium risk, flood zone 3 being high risk, and quite clearly there won't be any development at all in flood zone 3, and you can have development in flood zone 2 if certain tests are met. So at the planning application stage, the developers of the triangle site will need to provide a detailed site-specific flood risk assessment that will look at flooding issues in far more detail, but some of the site is also retained within the greenbelt as well. So by no means all of that site will be developed for employment uses.
Thank you, Ian. There is, for anyone who's interested in looking more, there is a flood map for planning. If you type in Environment Agency flood map for planning, you can see which, for a given site, which areas fall within flood zone 1, flood zone 2, and the highest risk of flooding, flood zone 3. And as Ian has explained, quite a bit of the triangle site is at risk of flooding, and that was certainly recognised through the local plan examination discussions, and certainly the Environment Agency will be involved to make sure that whatever form of development is proposed on the triangle site, it doesn't put those people who are going to be working on the site at risk, but equally the development won't be allowed to result in a greater risk of flooding on the adjacent strategic roads or to adjacent properties, and that'll be a test that's considered at detail at the planning application stage. We've then got a question about the scale of development and the number of people that are going to be living in Southwest Maidenhead, and what percentage increase that is on the population of Maidenhead as a whole at the moment. See a couple of people here trying to do some quick maths probably, but we've generally worked, I might have changed a little bit, but 2.2 people per household. So you might be looking at 5,500–6,000 additional residents on Southwest Maidenhead. I'm afraid I'm not sure what the existing population of Greater Maidenhead is at the moment, but I'm sure someone can have a quick look at that and give you an indication of what percentage increase that would be. We'll come back to that. I think there's a couple more questions that are coming through. Yeah, so I think this is about to be published, but a question around are the developers decided already? So who's going to be building out the various land parcels? And a specific question about why have Berkeley Homes submitted their planning application already before the SPD has been finalised. Ian Manktelow, do you want to respond on that one?
Yes, I'll just come in. I was trying to find a population with Maidenhead, didn't quite get there. So I think it's probably important to understand that as part of preparing the SPD, we have been I suppose discussing elements of it with the developers. That's not to I suppose give them favourable sort of consideration, if you like, but it's so they are aware of I suppose our thinking on what will be in the SPD, so it can shape their planning applications, because as Ian Motchell explained in terms of where this document fits in the planning process, it sits in the middle, and critically it is a document that is setting a lot of principles that we then want developers to reflect in their more detailed schemes. So that's the purpose of the document and how it relates to planning applications. Yes, Berkeley Homes have already submitted an application. I think obviously we would prefer that we had got through the whole process of preparing the SPD before they did that, but we cannot stop a developer putting a planning application in. I think it's probably fair to say they were broadly aware of what would be in the draft SPD. They clearly don't know what will be in the final SPD once we've considered everyone's comments and updated the document, and that's sort of their risk, if you like. So why they've submitted it, one presumes they want to get on and develop the site. Now the site is allocated in the borough local plan, but so we would prefer if they had waited. Clearly, from the point of view of us as a council determining a planning application, it takes us some time to go through the detail of what they submitted. It often requires clarification on some of the supporting information they provide with the application. Sometimes there are amendments to schemes. So the time at which we determine an application is when we then have to take account of the most recent sort of policy and guidance documents, and so that could be a little bit further down the line, and we may know what changes are going to be made to the SPD that can inform our decision on the Berkeley scheme, and obviously any other schemes that may come in the meantime.
I think just to add to that, in terms of the developers already being decided, that the majority of the developers, if not all of them, have had an interest in the parcels of land whilst the council were going through the process of preparing and adopting the local plan. So it's not a case, apart from for the golf course land, where the council decided to enter into a joint venture with Carla Homes. On the other land parcels, those developers took the view that the land had development potential, and then promoted that land through the local plan process. So they chose themselves, and it's that group of developers that the council has been speaking to, as Ian explained, to ensure that they understand what it is we're trying to achieve, and they know what is coming in terms of requirements when they submit their planning applications.
Ian, I can just help you on the population of Maidenhead a little bit, if that.
I've had, yeah, go on. Yes, go
on. In 2020, the estimate for the population of what's called the unparished area of Maidenhead, so this is slightly more, so it would exclude areas like Cox Green, but I suppose the main parts of Maidenhead, the population was 52,000. So I suppose a sort of estimate of population for the Southwest Maidenhead area development of 5,500 to 6,000, I suppose, is something just over a 10% increase on the population overall.
Yeah, I think Ian Motchell had got a figure for a sort of a wider, sort of greater Maidenhead, I suppose, and I've done some quick number crunching there. It was about 8%, so it's 8 to 10% increase. God, Ian.
I'm just going to add to that. We have to remember, of course, that some of the people living in the new houses will already live in Maidenhead, but it may well be that they are living in unsuitable accommodation. So there is likely to be a sort of a suppressed need, if you like, figure for people who are moving from maybe, sleeping on somebody's, I don't know, in a couch or something, settee, and moving into their own accommodation. So yeah, it won't all be new people moving from outside the town.
Yeah, Yeah, I think a lot of that, Ian, is where older children are still living with their parents, and there aren't suitable properties for them to move in. So those are the suppressed households, or a lot of the suppressed households that you're talking about, and hopefully South West Maidenhead will help those to get their first foot on the housing ladder. There's then a question about what percentage of green belt are you looking to use for this development? Well, the answer to that question is zero, because the local plan has now been adopted, and that land for South West Maidenhead is no longer in the green belt, save for an area on the western end of the triangle site, which is to remain or is remaining in the green belt, but isn't proposed for development as part of the commercial space coming forward on the triangle site. And then there's a question quite specifically about, I'm afraid I can't help with this one, but have Carla Homes made any payments to the council yet? And is this a done deal that they will develop the golf course? I don't know whether anybody has got any further insight into the arrangement with Carla Homes.
Yeah, Ian, I think Ian Maxwell here. Well, certainly not privy to whether any payments have been made yet, but I mean, clearly there is a joint venture agreement between the council and Carla Homes, clearly with the intention that Carla will be the developer of the golf course site. So I think, you know, the expectation would be that Carla would develop the golf course site. That is certainly thinking, but can't help on the issue of payments.
Yeah. So I'm just going back through. I think we've responded to all of the questions that have come through. Yeah, I think we've come to the end of the questions, unless anybody has anything else that they'd like to raise. No, well, if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to hand back to Councillor Hasler to make some closing comments. Although, sorry, just as I'm speaking, I have seen perhaps one final question here that's now just been published. Sorry. So put it another way, this is in relation, I think, to my comments on the loss of greenbelt land. What is the loss of green space in Maidenhead through this proposed development? Ian Manxlow, I don't think we have a precise figure, other than to say at the moment it's a golf course where there isn't wider public access. It certainly will be the case that the open space provided as part of this development will be publicly accessible, but clearly if you're accommodating 2,600 new homes and the commercial developments on the triangle site, there will be a loss of green field or golf course land, but in terms of public access to that green space, that will be increased through the planned development. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ian?
I suppose just in terms of land area, I don't have the precise figure, but I think the golf course occupies something just over 50 hectares of land. That's about 125 acres in sort of old money, so to speak. So that's the total sort of size of the golf course area. And as Ian Gillespie says, then there will still be there will be a loss of some green space, but an increase in the accessibility of the green space that remains. But that gives you an indication of the total amount of land you're looking at on the golf course.
Yeah. And there are a few more questions coming in now, so we'll keep going. A question about when we're hoping the development will start. And as we've mentioned already, Berkeley Homes have got a planning application in at the moment. That planning application will need to be considered and determined, and then there will be some pre-commencement conditions to be discharged, the things the Berkeley Homes has to do before they can start on site. And then you would normally expect a sort of 6-month preparatory period and getting the site ready for development, and then they could commence, probably allowing the first homes, I think, at the earliest, perhaps by the end of 2023, possibly early 2024. I think would be the sort of earliest you might start seeing some development coming forward and being occupied on the site.
It's worth just adding in relation to the golf course part of the site, the golf club obviously are still there, and they can remain on the site, and golf can still take place on the site until the end of 2025, and at that point they have to surrender the lease that they have for use of the site as a golf course. So Carla Homes wouldn't be able to, if you like, get onto the site, onto the golf course until 2026. So I suppose the point being, the golf course development will probably not start until a bit later than some of the development on the south side of the Harvest Hill Road, obviously the Berkeley scheme being the one that's coming first.
Yeah, I think so. This came through in some of the discussions on the at the local plan examination about the sort of time frame for delivery, and I think the golf course development that may well not be completed until sort of 2034, 2035, depending upon what happens with the wider economy and build out rates and any other issues that arise along the way. So it is quite a long build programme for the development to be completed. Back to infrastructure issues and whether there have been any discussions around adequate water supply for the site, given the scale of development planned in Maidenhead as a whole. Ian Motchell, is that one that you can pick up?
Yes, thanks, Ian. Again, going back to the borough local plan, the local plan was underpinned by infrastructure delivery plan, which was kept a sort of living document, and there were numerous discussions with utility providers, including the water supply companies, and as part of that process we were confident and comfortable that there were no showstopper issues in terms of water supply, and that the water companies would be able to provide that infrastructure provision for water supply in a sort of timely manner to meet the delivery deadlines that we were just discussing.
Thank you, Ian. There's a brief question that's come through about when the works on the golf course site will start, which I think Ian Maxlow has responded to. And then there's a question which, unfortunately, when they come through to us, we can't see them connected to a previous question. So the question raises, so how much will be left of that, e.g. 25%? Not quite sure what question that was connected to. It might possibly be about the open space, but if the person who asked that question could just clarify, we can respond. So come back to that in a moment. Then there's a question around which ward the Berkeley Homes application is in. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that instantly, but we can check that and come back to that question. And I see someone's now responded on, I meant what percentage of AL13 will be left is green space? very much doubt we have a precise figure. Rob, is that something that Rob Smith, is that something you can help with sort of in general terms?
Yes, in general terms, and I think you made the point. It's hard to give a definitive figure on that now. It does depend on how detailed applications come forward, how they lay out their developments and integrate open space into specific proposals. And obviously at this stage we don't have detailed planning applications across the entire site to work that out. Obviously the illustrative framework plan itself does indicate some fairly substantial areas that will be retained in open space. So in particular around the buffers on the edges to the south, and things like Rushington Copse will be retained, and introducing these sort of green corridors to link them up, as well as pocket parks would be provided within each individual development. So there'll be quite a patchwork and a network of green spaces within there, but until we get detailed applications, I don't think you can define a figure just yet.
Thank you. I can see a couple of people are checking, I think, the location of the Berkeley Homes application.
I'm just looking at the moment, and you've got Braywald and Oldfield Ward. Was it? I think it was wards we were talking about, wasn't it, rather than parishes? Yeah, and it looks like to me as if the Berkeley scheme is sort of on near the boundary of those two wards, unless somebody else can tell me differently.
Yeah, it looks to me as though it might just be within Bray, but it's a bit difficult on the scale of the map I'm looking at to work it out. But as you say, in Bray and Oldfield.
We can clarify that, I think, Ian's, can't we, in the FAQs?
Yeah, we can do that.
So I'll pause briefly because the last time I tried to wrap up, there was a small flurry of questions that came through. So if there are any other questions, if you could post those now, please.
Ian, I think it's Oldfield Ward, because Bray Ward is south of Kimbers Lane, and that's where the boundary is. So Spring Hill, and to the west of Spring Hill and to the east of Spring Hill would actually be Oldfield Ward, according to the RBWM neighbourhood map.
Thank you, Councillor Hassler. We'll confirm that in the FAQ response after this session. So I haven't got any further questions that have come through. So I will now hand over to Councillor Hassler, who has a few final words before we close this session. Many thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Ian. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the consultation events and for all the constructive questions and comments received. This has proved incredibly useful in the preparation of the SPD. Please remember that all of the details regarding the South West Maidenhead supplementary planning document can be found on the council website and in Maidenhead Library. And I would encourage everyone to submit comments before the deadline of midnight on the 17th of August. All comments will be considered in the preparation of the final version of this document. I'd also like to thank the Council's communication team for facilitating this online event, and the Planning Policy Officer team, who have worked incredibly hard in their preparation of the draft SPD and the consultation itself, delivering helpful and detailed presentations and explanations to your questions for the 3 in-person drop-in events and tonight's online event. The officers will continue working hard, considering all of the consultation comments in preparation of the final supplementary planning document. So thank you again, everyone, for participating in this process. It's incredibly important, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, and good night.